The candles in the long drawing room of Ashcroft Park had been lit at 4 o'clock, which meant by 6 they had burned low enough to cast every face into uncertain shadow, and it was in that uncertain shadow that Miss Cecily Vane understood, with the particular clarity that humiliation produces, exactly what her uncle had done. She stood beside the hearth, because there was nowhere else to stand. The room held 43 people, and she had counted them twice in the first minutes. Because counting was something to do with her hands while she kept her face still, and all 43 of them had arranged themselves away from her in the manner of water that has found the shape of a bowl, gathering at the edges and leaving the center empty. She was the center. She wore her best gown, which was 3 seasons old and pale gray, and entirely correct, and she was carrying in her hands the small ivory fan that had belonged to her mother, and these 2 objects were all that remained to her of any life she had previously understood herself to inhabit. "Miss Vane," said her uncle, crossing the room with the particular ease of a man who has never in his life been refused anything he genuinely wanted, "allow me to present Lord Ashcroft." She had heard of Lord Ashcroft. Everyone in England had heard of Lord Ashcroft. He was the Earl of Ashcroft, and he was 34 years old, and he was said to be the coldest man in England, though the people who said so said it with a kind of reverence that suggested coldness, in his particular case, was a form of power. He had not remarried since Lady Ashcroft died 3 years ago. He did not attend balls. He ran his estates with a precision that his tenants feared, and his steward described, once in a letter that was widely circulated, as the operation of a mind that found sentiment an inconvenient luxury. Cecily turned and looked at him. He was standing 4 feet away, and he was exactly as described. Tall, dark-coated, features arranged into an expression of absolute neutrality that could be read as either calm or contempt, depending on what one was prepared to believe about human nature. His eyes, which were a gray that held no warmth whatsoever, settled on her face with the efficiency of a man completing a task. He did not bow. He inclined his head very slightly. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was low and level, and carried no inflection she could interpret. "I understand we are to be married in a fortnight." She heard the breath go out of her uncle somewhere to her left. She heard a murmur move through the 43 people arranged around the bowl of the room. She heard her own heart, which had been steady all evening, take one sharp, incorrect beat. "I was not aware that it had been decided," she said carefully. His eyes did not change. "Your uncle was very clear." "My uncle," she said, "often is." There was a silence. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds she watched something move very briefly across his face, a flicker so small it might have been the candlelight rather than anything belonging to him. And then it was gone. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has decided to solve rather than avoid. "Shall we speak privately?" he said. "Or would you prefer the assistance of an audience?" It was not a kind question. It was also, she realized, not an unkind one. It was the question of a man who found other people's social machinery mildly contemptible and felt no need to hide it. "Privately," she said. And so it began. If you have never been sold, the mechanics of it are as follows. You are present in a room. The particulars have been decided elsewhere by people whose affection for you is genuine and whose judgment is catastrophically poor. And you discover the particulars in the presence of the man to whom you have been sold, which means you must arrange your face before you have had time to arrange your thoughts. And you must speak before you have any notion of what you actually mean to say. Cecily's uncle, Sir Aldous Vane, loved her in his way. She had understood this since the age of 14, when her father died. And Sir Aldous arrived at their small house in Wiltshire, with his large hands and his large debts and his genuine sorrow, and had taken her into his household with a sincerity that she did not doubt and a financial recklessness that she had been watching with increasing alarm for 7 years. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had spent his entire life believing that the next thing would resolve the previous thing, and the debts he had accumulated in service of this belief were, by the autumn of Cecily's 21st year, very considerable. Lord Ashcroft's steward had called in November. Sir Aldous' note of hand was due in January. The estate in Wiltshire, which had been Cecily's father's, and therefore technically Cecily's, in every sentimental sense, though not in any legal one, would pass to the Earl's creditors in the new year unless Sir Aldous could produce £6,000. He could not produce £6,000. He could, however, produce a niece. Lord Ashcroft required a mistress of his house. His daughter, Lady Eleanor, was 7 years old and in need of a mother's influence, or so the solicitors had determined. The child had been running her nursemaid ragged, had reduced 2 governesses to resignation, and had recently fed the estate's prize hound an entire jar of anchovy paste out of what the nursemaid described, with exhausted dignity, as scientific curiosity. Lord Ashcroft was not a man who permitted disorder. He required a woman capable of managing a household, a child, and a social season without disturbing the precise running of his affairs. Cecily, in Sir Aldous' description of her, was exactly that woman. She was, in fact, exactly that woman. She had been managing Sir Aldous' household since she was 16. She had learned, in the doing of it, that account books do not lie, and that charm is a luxury one sets aside when the household bills come due. She had learned the names of every tradesman and the preferences of every cook, and the exact amount of flattery required to keep a footman from giving notice. She was practical and honest, and possessed of a quality that Sir Aldous had always described as stubbornness, and that she privately understood to be something closer to the refusal to pretend. It was this quality, this particular inability to pretend, that she carried with her into the small withdrawing room off the hall where Lord Ashcroft had led her, and it was this quality that made her, once the door was closed and they were alone, turn to face him without the softening gestures the situation might have called for, and say, "I will not be married to a man who has purchased me, but I will consider a contract." He looked at her for a long moment. The withdrawing room held one lamp, which cast the light of it at a low, warm angle across the angles of his face. And in that light, she could see that he was not, in fact, cold in the way a person is cold when they do not feel things. He was cold in the way a person is cold when they have decided that feeling things is a process they will manage privately, in rooms other people do not enter. "A contract," he said. "6 months," she said. "I will manage your household, oversee your daughter's instruction, and fulfill the social obligations you require for the season. At the end of 6 months, if we suit, we discuss marriage properly, between equals. If we do not suit, my uncle's debt is forgiven regardless, and I am returned to Wiltshire with a settlement sufficient to establish a small household of my own." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, which was interesting, because he thought the way a man thinks when he is genuinely considering something rather than performing the appearance of consideration. "You have a high opinion of your own value," he said. "I have," she said. "An accurate one, which I imagine is something of a novelty in your experience of women being presented to you." That flicker again. Very small, very brief. She would learn, in time, to watch for it the way one watches for the first pale light before dawn, knowing it matters, but never entirely certain it has come. "Monday week," he said. "The carriage will arrive at 9. She arrived at Ashcroft Park on a morning in late October, when the sky was the color of pewter and the elms along the drive had gone entirely to gold. The house was large in the way that suggests a family that has not had to count anything for several generations, built of pale gray stone that absorbed the morning light and gave it back slightly altered. Cecily sat in the carriage and looked at it, and thought, I have 6 months to make this work. Do not think less of her for the thought. She was 21 years old, and she had been given, in the manner of livestock at a country fair, to a man who had not bothered to meet her before the transaction was complete. She was allowed to think whatever she liked. She was met at the door by a housekeeper of considerable efficiency and by Lady Eleanor, who arrived 17 seconds after the housekeeper in a state that suggested she had been running. The child was 7, and compact and dark-haired like her father, and she had the expression of a person who has decided, as a matter of policy, not to like anyone, and is waiting to see whether the person in front of her will be worth revising that policy for. Cecily looked at her for a long moment. You are smaller than I expected, Cecily said. Eleanor's chin came up. I am exactly the right size. I expect you are. Will you show me the house? The child considered this for a moment with the gravity of a small judge. Papa says I am to be in the schoolroom. Your papa, Cecily said, is not here, and I should very much like to know where the still room is before I speak to Cook, or Cook will have the advantage of me, and I prefer not to begin disadvantaged. This was, she would later understand, the correct thing to say. Eleanor led her through the house in the manner of a general conducting a survey, pointing out the gallery, the morning room, the library. She slowed slightly in the doorway of the library, which was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a writing table positioned before a window that looked onto the lawn, and Cecily noted the slight slowing and stored it for later. Finally, the still room, where Cecily spent 20 minutes speaking to the cook with the thoroughness of a woman who has learned that domestic harmony begins with cook and ends everywhere else. Lord Ashcroft arrived home at 5:30. She heard him in the entrance hall, the exchange with the footman, the economy of a man who does not spend words he does not need to spend. She was in the small sitting room that had been designated as her private parlor, writing her first inventory of the household, and she did not go to meet him. He found her. He filled the doorway in a way she had not entirely expected, which was that he was not attempting to fill it. He was simply present, and the doorway happened to organize itself around him. He looked at the desk, at the inventory, at her pen moving across it. How is the house? He said. The kitchen garden is in good order. The still room is adequately stocked, but not optimally. The linen cupboard wants organization, which I will address on Thursday. The library's east shelves have been allowed to drift from their cataloging order, which I understand from Eleanor has been the case since last spring. She paused. Eleanor is very bright. She is also very lonely, which I expect you know. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It was the first word he had spoken that carried anything in it she could read. She looked at him, and he was looking at the window. And for a moment she saw in his profile the specific shape of a man who carries something he does not put down. Good evening, my lord, she said, and returned to her inventory. By November's end, the household had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to deny. The footman moved with more purpose. The cook produced meals with a pride she had previously reserved for feast days. Eleanor had been persuaded into a reading routine that she would have resisted from anyone else, and that she submitted to from Cecily, because Cecily did not frame it as instruction, so much as a shared investigation of whatever question had most recently occurred to Eleanor, which was, depending on the day, and the questions ranged from why snails carry their houses to whether the Romans had been frightened of anything, and whether a person could train a cat. It was the cat that brought them to the library together one Thursday morning, Eleanor draped over the arm of the large leather chair with a natural history volume balanced on her knees, and Cecily at the writing table, and Lord Ashcroft, who arrived at 11 in search of something from the desk and stopped in the doorway because the room was occupied in a way it had not been for 3 years. Cecily did not look up from what she was reading. "The third drawer," she said. "The correspondence is filed by date now. If you are looking for the Harwick letter, it is under November 14th. There was a pause. "How did you know that was what I was looking for?" he said. "You spoke to the steward yesterday morning for 20 minutes. The only outstanding matter the steward mentioned at supper was the Harwick drainage dispute. It seemed the most probable reason you would come to the library at a time you do not usually use it." Another pause. She heard him cross to the desk. She heard the third drawer. She did not look up. What she did not see, and could not have seen, and would not learn of until much later, was that he stood for a moment with the letter in his hand, and looked at her, at the line of her shoulders bent over her book, at the unconscious efficiency of her attention, with an expression that the third footman, who had been briefly visible in the hallway, and who had the bad luck to glance inward at the wrong moment, would describe afterward to the cook as the look of a man who has just found something he thought he had lost, and does not yet know what to do about having found it. He sat at the desk. He read the letter. He did not leave for 40 minutes. It was Lady Darrow who named the thing first, which was fitting, because Lady Darrow had been naming things no one else would say for 30 years, and found the habit entirely too useful to abandon. She arrived in the second week of December for a shooting party that Lord Ashcroft held annually out of obligation rather than pleasure, and she had Cecily's measure inside the first half hour. "Miss Vane," she said in the drawing-room before supper, in a tone that was perfectly audible to the 7 other women present, "you have managed rather a great deal here in 6 weeks. The house has quite changed character." "The house was well run before I arrived," Cecily said. "I have merely organized what was already there." Lady Darrow's fan moved at a precise angle. "And Lord Ashcroft? Have you organized what was already there as well?" There was a murmur. Not unkind, precisely, but calibrated to carry. "Lord Ashcroft," Cecily said pleasantly, "manages himself with considerable efficiency. I imagine he would find any assistance from me unnecessary." "Quite so," said Lady Darrow, with a smile that said she did not believe a word of it. She was not alone in that. The shooting party ran 3 days, and in those 3 days a version of Cecily Vane was assembled by the assembled guests that she had no power to refute, because it was not untrue so much as it was premature. She was, in this version, a woman who had arrived at Ashcroft Park by arrangement, and who was now conducting herself with such determined competence that she might be excused for forgetting the circumstances of her arrival. She was the girl who had been sold. They said it with the particular gentleness that contains the most efficient cruelty, a lowering of the voice that was really only a mechanism for making everyone else lean in to hear. "Poor creature," said Mrs. Hadley Cross on the second morning to a small group in the morning room that did not include Cecily, but did include the second youngest footman, who remembered things. "Sold like livestock, and now she is playing house as though she earned it." Cecily heard this report at 4 o'clock, delivered by Eleanor, who had been in the hall outside the morning room and who had the excellent hearing of a child determined to know what adults are concealing. "She said livestock," Eleanor reported, with a gravity that suggested she had been weighing the word all afternoon. "I thought that was a very rude word to use about a person." "It is," Cecily said. "Come and show me the natural history plate you mentioned yesterday, the one about the migration of birds." She said nothing else about it. She did not take it to Lord Ashcroft, and she did not arrange her face into any expression that the guests might read as wounded. She went to supper that evening in the gray gown, and she managed the table with the same precise, quiet efficiency with which she managed everything. And when Lord Ashcroft, at the head of the table, asked her opinion of the Harwick drainage solution she had apparently outlined to the steward, she answered him in the level-specific terms she used for all practical questions, and she did not look at Mrs. Hadley Cross at all. Lord Ashcroft said very little. He had said very little across all 3 days of the party, which was consistent with his character and which she had ceased to read as rudeness. What she noticed, because she had become, without intending to, a careful student of his particular economies, was that he said very little and looked a great deal, and that the direction of his looking, across the 3 days, had shifted in a way that was not loud and was not dramatic and was entirely impossible for her to dismiss. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is still deciding whether to reach for. She told herself she had imagined it. She was very good at telling herself things. December brought the quiet week between Christmas and the New Year. And in that quiet week, with the shooting party gone and Eleanor in the schoolroom and the household reduced to its ordinary rhythms, Lord Ashcroft did something he had not done in 3 years. He sat in the library in the evenings. He sat in the large leather chair beside the fire, which was Eleanor's chair in the mornings, and he read, and on the second evening Cecily came in at 8 o'clock to retrieve a household inventory she had left on the writing table, and found him there, and stopped. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I will be quick." "You do not need to be quick," he said, without looking up from his book. And then, after a moment, he said, "I have been meaning to ask. The catalog you created for the East Shelves. Eleanor showed me the system." She had not known Eleanor had shown him. "It is only a simple organization by subject and then by date." "It is very useful," he said. He looked up then, and she was still standing between the door and the desk, and he said, "Will you sit?" She sat, because she could think of no reasonable objection, and she retrieved her inventory and began reviewing it, and the fire settled, and the clock on the mantel marked the half-hour and the full hour, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. It was the most comfortable silence she had spent in another person's presence in as long as she could remember. He broke it at 9:15. "My wife liked this room," he said. He did not look up from his book. She did not respond immediately. She knew what it cost him to offer a sentence that began that way, and she had no intention of handling it carelessly. "It is a good room for thinking," she said at last. She used to read here in the evenings. Still not looking up. She was very ill at the end. She spent the last 3 months almost entirely in her rooms, and the library stood empty. After, I found I could not come into it for some time. "And now," she said very quietly. He looked up then. His eyes found hers across the room, and the fire between them threw a warm, imprecise light. And he looked at her for a moment with an expression that had not been designed for anyone to see. "Now," he said, "it seems to have become a room again." She looked down at her inventory. Her hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. She pressed it flat against the page. She stayed until 10 o'clock, which was 20 minutes longer than she had intended, and she did not allow herself to think about it afterward. Or she tried not to, with the limited success of a woman who has spent the last 6 weeks pretending that what she was engaged in was a practical arrangement rather than something she did not have adequate words for. January arrived with frost, and with it Lady Ashcroft, which was the title belonging to Lord Ashcroft's mother, who was not dead, and who was, in fact, 64 years old, and in the full vigorous possession of her faculties and her opinions. She arrived on the 3rd day of the new year without announcement. which was, Cecily would learn, her characteristic mode of arrival, which was a notice given at 12 hours, long enough to be technically courteous and short enough to be tactically useful. The Dowager Countess of Ashcroft was a small woman who carried herself like a large one. She had her son's coloring and her son's capacity for extended silence and her own particular addition to these qualities, which was that she deployed her silences as weapons rather than as personal habit. She sat in the morning room on her third day and looked at Cecily across the tea tray with the expression of a woman who has spent 40 years reading drawing rooms and does not intend to stop now. "So," she said, "you are the arrangement." "I am Miss Vane," Cecily said. "It is very good to meet you, my lady." "Is it?" The Countess lifted her cup. "My son tells me the household is well run. I hope it is tolerably comfortable. He tells me Eleanor has been reading every morning." A pause. "Eleanor has not read voluntarily since she was 6. She reads about things that interest her," Cecily said. The difficulty was that she was previously required to read about things that were considered improving, which are not always the same things. The Countess set down her cup. She looked at Cecily for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," she said, and her tone made it entirely unclear whether this was approbation or its opposite. "I rarely am," Cecily said. She expected the Countess to press harder. She had prepared for harder, for the version of this conversation that would include the word arrangement, used multiple more times, and a pointed reference to Sir Aldous' debt, and some comment arranged to land in the precise register of kindly concern that would nevertheless leave a mark. She had prepared for this because she knew it was coming, and she was not wrong in principle, only in timing. It came 3 days later, at a dinner that included the local rector and his wife, a neighboring family called the Marvishes, and a cousin of the Countess called Mr. Reginald Fellows, who was 45 and prosperous, and who looked at Cecily with the particular attention of a man who has been told things about her history and found them interesting. Mr. Fellows sat beside her at dinner. He was pleasant in the surface ways, and he spoke well about horses, and less well about everything else, and somewhere between the soup and the removes, he said, with a casualness clearly designed to suggest the words had arrived naturally. "I understand you are here under an arrangement of some delicacy." "I manage Lord Ashcroft's household," she said. "It is a professional position." "Quite so." He refilled his glass. "And what becomes of you, Miss Vane, when the arrangement concludes? Has the Earl made provision?" She looked at him steadily. "The Earl and I have agreed terms that are satisfactory to both of us." "Of course." He smiled. It was a smile that had been designed by long practice to seem kind. "Only, and forgive me, I mean this with every good intention, only that an arrangement of this sort can be rather difficult to extract oneself from, with one's reputation intact. Women in ambiguous positions so often find themselves at the end of them more ambiguous than they were at the beginning." She set down her own glass. She looked at him. She said, in the perfectly even voice she used for things she had decided, "I have found, Mr. Fellows, that the people most invested in discussing a woman's ambiguity are generally those who would benefit from her believing herself to have less standing than she does. I am quite clear on my standing. I expect you will find me so in the future." There was a silence. The rector's wife had heard it. Mrs. Marvish had heard it. The Countess, at the foot of the table, had most certainly heard it. And when Cecily glanced in her direction, she found the Countess looking at her with an expression that she had not worn before, 2 parts assessment, and something beneath it that might very cautiously be called respect. Lord Ashcroft had heard it as well. She knew because when she looked at the head of the table, he was not looking at his plate. He was looking at her, with the flat gray eyes that she had been learning all these months to read like a text in a language she had not studied in any formal way, but was becoming fluent in by something closer to instinct. And what she read in them, in the moment before he looked away and lifted his own glass with the unhurried precision that was characteristic of him in all things, was something that made her heart perform. Again, that sharp, incorrect beat. If you had asked her then whether she knew what was happening to her, she would have told you she did not allow herself to think of it in those terms. She had an arrangement. She had 6 months. She had the terms she had negotiated in a small withdrawing room in October with the clarity of a woman who could not afford to be imprecise. She had not negotiated for this other thing, which had no name she was prepared to give it, and which arrived, unbidden and inconvenient, in the library in the evenings, and at dinner when he looked at her, and in the mornings when Eleanor appeared at her door with a question. And the question was almost always something that had first been introduced in a conversation with Lord Ashcroft. She did not allow herself to think of it. She managed the household and supervised Eleanor's lessons, and dealt with the Dowager Countess and the account books and the letters, and she did not think of it. January passed. February arrived. February brought the matter of the tenants' cottages in the North Field, which had been in need of repair since the previous spring, and which the steward had been meaning to address, and had not. Cecily raised it in her weekly account review with Lord Ashcroft, which she conducted on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock in the estate office, and which had become, over the preceding months, the hour she looked forward to most in the week, and the hour she was least willing to examine closely. She laid the accounts before him. She had been through them over the weekend and had marked the deferred maintenance in red ink, which she knew he would notice because he noticed everything. "The Caldwell and Petch cottages," she said. "The thatch is failing. If it is not addressed before March, it will not hold the spring rains, and you will have 2 families either in inadequate shelter or on the estate's charity, which costs more in the long term than rethatching does now." He looked at the figures she had marked. He was close to her at the estate table, closer than he usually was, because she had spread the accounts across it, and he had bent to look at them, and the morning light was coming in from the east window, and she was sharply aware of exactly how much space there was between his shoulder and her own. "You are right," he said. "Send for the thatcher on Wednesday." "I already have," she said. "He comes Thursday. I wanted your approval before I confirmed." He looked at her. She was looking at the accounts. He said, "Miss Vane?" She looked up. He was quite close. The light was at that angle. "I think," he said very carefully, as though each word required individual consideration, "that you could have confirmed the appointment without my approval, and I would not have found fault with it." Her heart was doing the thing again. She kept her voice level. "I would rather work within the terms of our agreement." "Our agreement," he said. And something in his tone shifted, something she could not quite identify. "Gives you rather less authority than you have actually taken. I have not found that a difficulty." She looked at him for a moment. He was serious. He was always serious. But this was a different register of seriousness, the kind that comes from meaning something rather than simply stating it. "Then I will confirm it directly," she said. He straightened. He moved back to his own side of the table. He picked up his pen. The moment closed. She walked to the window and looked out at the north field for a count of 10, which was what she permitted herself. And then she turned back and said, "The accounts for January are balanced. Shall I go through the February projections?" "Yes," he said. He did not look up. "Please." It was the first time he had said please to her in the context of anything that was not offered entirely as courtesy. It was not a small thing. She did not say so. The second week of February, Eleanor found the miniature. It was in the top drawer of the writing table in the library, which Eleanor should not have been opening, and which she had opened because she was 7 years old and constitutionally incapable of leaving closed drawers closed. And what she brought to Cecily that afternoon was a small oval frame in tarnished silver. And inside it, a portrait of a woman with dark hair and a particular kind of quiet in her eyes. "It is Mamma," Eleanor said. She said it without distress, which surprised Cecily. "Papa keeps it in the drawer. I think he looks at it when no one is there." Cecily held the miniature very carefully. "Yes," she said. "Do you think he is still sad about her?" She considered this question with the gravity it deserved. "I think grief does not have a fixed duration," she said. "Some people are sad for a long time about someone they loved, and that is not a problem to be solved. It is only what love looks like when it has lost its home." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He laughs more now. When you are at dinner. He does not laugh out loud, but his face does something different." Cecily handed the miniature back carefully. "Put it back exactly as you found it," she said. "And do not tell him you looked." Eleanor replaced the miniature. She did not tell him. She did tell Cecily, 2 days later, that she had overheard Lord Ashcroft speaking to the steward about the question of whether the arrangement with Miss Vane had an established conclusion date, and that the steward had said he believed it was 6 months from October, and that Lord Ashcroft had said, in the tone Eleanor described as the one where he does not want to say more, that he supposed they would need to revisit that. Cecily received this information with a still face and a very unsteady interior, and sent Eleanor to the schoolroom with a mathematics problem. March arrived before she was ready for it. She was in the kitchen garden on the morning of the 1st of March, talking to the gardener about the forcing frame for the early lettuces when she heard the carriage arrive at the house. She did not think anything of it. Guests arrived, guests departed. The household managed both, until the gardener's boy came running to tell her that her uncle was here, and a solicitor, and Lord Ashcroft's mother, and they were all in the drawing room, and Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, thought Miss Vane had better come. She came. The scene in the drawing room was not, in its outward appearance, dramatic. Sir Aldous sat in a chair by the window, with his large hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who has arrived to do something he has been dreading. The solicitor sat at the writing table with a leather document case. The Dowager Countess stood beside the fireplace with her arms folded, which was not her characteristic posture, and suggested she had been arguing. Lord Ashcroft stood in the center of the room. He looked at her when she came in, and she read his face with the fluency she had spent 6 months acquiring. And what she read was that something had been decided, and she should have been consulted before it was, and he was aware of that. She looked at her uncle. "Sir Aldous." He cleared his throat. "My dear, I am afraid there is a complication." The complication was this. Sir Aldous had borrowed from another quarter in November, while Cecily had been at Ashcroft Park. A smaller debt, he said. A modest sum. Only a stopgap measure while the arrangement with Lord Ashcroft was being established, and the man he had borrowed from was Mr. Cresswell of Bath, and Mr. Cresswell had recently decided to call in his note as well. The sum was £1,200. It was due in 3 weeks. "I do not have it," Sir Aldous said. He said it with the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying this truth for some time, and is relieved, in his way, to put it down. "I thought perhaps Lord Ashcroft, given the arrangement already in place, it seemed natural to approach." "You thought," Cecily said very quietly, "that Lord Ashcroft could be persuaded to discharge another of your debts, my dear. I am not cross with you, she said, and she was not, which was the particular difficulty of loving someone whose judgment is poor, which is that the anger never quite catches, because the person is exactly as you have always known them to be. I am simply being accurate. She turned to look at Lord Ashcroft. He was watching her. He had been watching her the entire time, she understood, in the way she had come to understand everything about how he attended to her, which was entirely, and as though he had decided some time ago that this was where his attention would be. My lord, she said, I must ask you directly whether my uncle has placed you in a position you did not anticipate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Cecily. It was the first time. Her name, in his voice, in this room, in front of her uncle and the solicitor and his mother, and all the evidence of everything that had produced her here. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. Come outside, he said. If you please. If you have never stood in a walled garden in the first week of March, when the frost has gone but the air still carries the memory of it, and been asked a question you did not know was coming, you will have to take on faith what it feels like. The walled garden at Ashcroft Park was old, older than the house, built of the same pale gray stone, and the first green was beginning at the edges of the forcing beds, and the light was that particular March light that is not yet warm but has stopped being cold. He stopped by the old sundial in the center of the garden, which was positioned wrong and had been giving the incorrect time for at least 30 years, and he turned to face her. I am going to say something, he said, and I would like you to let me finish it before you respond. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment, which she knew by now was not hesitation, so much as it was the arrangement of words he intended to mean. When I agreed to this arrangement, he said, I believed I required a household manager and a woman of sufficient capability to manage a season without requiring my active participation in the management. I believed I had organized a practical solution to a practical problem. She waited. I was correct about the practical problem, he said. I was not correct about what I required. She looked at him. March light. The sundial. The first faint green at the edge of the beds. I require, he said, with the precision of a man who has been considering something for some time and has arrived at the statement that is exactly the right size for the truth it contains, considerably more than I contracted for. I have been trying to determine how to say that to you, without it sounding as though it is another arrangement, because it is not another arrangement. And I would rather say nothing than have you understand it as one. She did not say anything. She could not, quite, find the words in the right order. I would like, he said very carefully, to ask you to marry me. Not as a continuation of the contract, as a question, to which I understand you might say no, and to which I would. He stopped. He looked at her steadily. I would find that answer very difficult, he said, which from him she understood was the same as saying something large. She took a breath. The March air came in cold and clean. In October, she said, I told you I would not be married to a man who had purchased me. Yes, he said. I did not say anything about a man who asked. He was still for a moment. The garden was very quiet. The sundial did not tell the correct time, but she thought perhaps that was all right. He reached out, and his hand settled over hers, where it rested on the cold stone of the sundial. And she did not breathe. And he said, in a voice that had come down considerably from its usual level, and was now almost something she could describe as gentle, Then I am asking, Cecily. I am asking you plainly. She turned her hand over beneath his and held it. Yes, she said. The Dowager Countess was not surprised. She said so at supper, in the manner of a woman who has been managing the information for some weeks and is relieved to have it confirmed, and she said something else as well, which was that in 30 years of attending drawing rooms she had not previously encountered a young woman who had managed to improve her son's household, his account books, and his temper simultaneously, and that this was a thing worth respecting regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. Sir Aldous wept, which was not unexpected. The solicitor discharged the note in question from documents Lord Ashcroft had already signed, which was also not entirely unexpected, given what she had come to understand about him and the way he managed things he had already decided. Eleanor was told at breakfast the following morning. She received the information with a moment of extended stillness that Cecily had learned to respect, because Eleanor's stillness meant she was considering something genuinely, rather than performing consideration. "Will you still teach me about the Romans?" she said. "Yes," Cecily said. "And the snails?" "We haven't finished the snails." Eleanor nodded. She accepted a piece of toast. She said, "Good," and ate it, and that was that. They were married on a Wednesday in early April at the parish church in the village, with the rector and his wife and Mrs. Marvish and a modest gathering of neighbors, and afterward there was a supper at the house that was neither grand nor austere, but simply good, which was the quality Cecily had always valued most in a household and intended to continue valuing. That evening, after the last guests had gone and Eleanor had been carried sleeping to the nursery by the nurse, Cecily sat in the library in the large leather chair beside the fire. She had a book open on her knee that she was not reading. The fire had burned down to a steady amber, and the room smelled of beeswax and old books and the faint last trace of wood smoke. Lord Ashcroft came in at 10:30. He had been speaking with the steward, and there was always something to speak with the steward about. And he stood for a moment in the doorway looking at the room. At her, with the expression she had first seen in October, as a flicker, and that she could now read with full fluency. He sat down in the chair across from her. He picked up his own book. He did not say anything. The fire crept lower. The clock on the mantel marked 11. She looked up and found him watching her over the edge of his book with the gray eyes that had never, she understood now, been cold. Only careful, the way a person is careful, with things that matter to them. On the writing table between them, in its place in the third drawer that she had quietly put right one morning in March, the small silver miniature kept its quiet vigil. She had moved it from the top drawer to the third, where it could be found without looking directly for it. And she had never told him. And she suspected he knew. And she suspected that was all right. She looked back at her book. The fire settled once more. Outside the library window, the park lay in the deep quiet of an April night, and in the orchard the first blossoms had opened that afternoon, pale against the dark, and they stayed that way, the two of them, in the room that was a room again, in the light of the fire that had been burning all winter, until the candle on the table between them burned down on its own and went gently out. If you found your way to the end of this story, leave a word in the quiet below. It means more than you know.